the forgotten soldiers of the rising sun.
Did you know that when the Second World War ended in 1945, many Japanese soldiers did not even know it was over? Some refused to surrender for years. Others vanished into the jungles, believing the emperor still waited for their victory. Their story is not one of glory, but of devotion, endurance, and sometimes sheer confusion. It begins in the heart of an empire that believed it could never fall. Japan, in the early 20th century, was rising fast. Once isolated, now industrial and proud, it saw itself as the rightful power of Asia. The emperor was divine. The army was his sword. In every school, children bowed toward the palace each morning. Loyalty was sacred. Death in battle was an honor. Survival after defeat was shame. These ideas would shape millions of young men who would march across the Pacific in the coming years. Let's drift to the 1930s, when Japan's ambitions grew restless. The empire had taken Korea and now looked toward China. In 1937, the war with China erupted after a skirmish near the Marco Polo Bridge. Japanese troops stormed through cities, leaving behind chaos and sorrow. They believed they were spreading order and divine purpose. In reality, they were walking deeper into a war that would drain their strength before the world as eyes. By the time 1941 arrived, Japan stood at a crossroads. The Western powers had blocked its oil. Its navy was strong, but its future was uncertain. The answer came in the form of a daring strike. On a quiet Sunday morning, the skies over Pearl Harbor roared with engines. Japanese planes flew low, releasing bombs that shattered the calm of Hawaii. Battleships burned. The world changed in an instant. Japan believed the attack had brought the Americans to their knees, but instead, it had awakened a giant. Soon the Pacific became a chessboard of islands and oceans. Japanese soldiers landed in the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and Indonesia. They advanced with precision. Discipline was their armor. Many carried little food, yet fought with unshaken belief. To them, every island taken was a step closer to destiny. But the tide was not in their favor for long. Let's move across to the Philippines, where Japanese forces faced a fierce resistance. American and Filipino troops were pushed back to Bataan. When they finally surrendered, thousands of prisoners were forced to march miles under a brutal sun with little water or rest. Many never made it. For the Japanese soldiers, the act was seen as duty fulfilled. For the prisoners, it became a symbol of suffering. This contrast of honor and horror defined the war's human cost. Far away on tiny islands, Japanese garrisons dug deep into caves, waiting for battles that might never come. They built tunnels, stocked rice, fought malaria, and whispered prayers to their ancestors. Letters from home stopped coming. The empire's promises faded. Yet they stayed at their posts. Some would wait years, believing that one more victory was still possible. In 1942, Japan reached its peak. From Manchuria to the South Pacific, its flag waved proudly. But beneath the surface, cracks appeared. Supplies ran low. American forces struck back at Midway, sinking 4 Japanese carriers in a single battle. It was a turning point. The empire's confidence began to falter, though few dared to admit it. On the home front, Japan's people faced rationing and constant fear. Bombers filled the skies over Tokyo. Wooden houses burned like paper. Still, the government spoke of glory and sacrifice. The radio told stories of victory even when cities lay in ruins. Mothers sent their sons away with tears hidden behind smiles. Every family carried the same prayer: bring honor to the emperor. Let's drift now to the islands of the South Pacific, where the jungles swallowed armies whole. On Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers faced hunger more than bullets. Food was scarce. Disease was constant. Yet they refused to surrender. They believed the spirits of the samurai watched over them. Each night they sang quietly to keep courage alive. When reinforcements failed to arrive, many chose death over capture. To die for the emperor was to live forever in spirit. Meanwhile, the Allied forces grew stronger. American factories built ships faster than Japan could sink them. Radios and radar began to outmatch bravery and belief. By 1944, the empire was shrinking. Each island lost was a wound to national pride. Yet the soldiers on the front still received orders written in the language of duty and honor. Fight until death, the papers read, and they did. Back in Japan, young boys trained with bamboo spears as the dream of victory crumbled. Kamikaze pilots wrote letters to their mothers before climbing into planes that would never return. Each flight was called a blossom, falling for the emperor. Each explosion, another act of devotion. By 1945, the skies darkened, not with clouds but with bombers. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, each city became a firestorm. Still, the soldiers on distant islands heard nothing. Some did not know Hiroshima and Nagasaki had vanished under new weapons of unimaginable power. Others heard rumors but refused to believe them. For them, surrender was impossible because surrender meant shame that would stain their ancestors. As the emperor finally spoke on the radio in August 1945, his voice soft and distant, the nation fell silent. For the first time, the divine had spoken not in command but in sorrow. "Endure the unendurable," he said. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Yet in the jungles of the Pacific, thousands of Japanese soldiers never heard that voice. Let us float toward those who did not return home, who stayed behind unaware that their empire had fallen. Some hid in caves waiting for orders that would never come. Others melted into local villages, surviving by hunting or farming. For them, the war continued not for months, but for decades. The soldiers who never surrendered. Let's drift deeper into the Pacific, where silence replaced the sound of battle. The year was 1945, but for many Japanese soldiers, the war had not ended. Their radios were broken. Their commanders were gone. Yet their belief remained unshaken. They were the emperor's men. Until he said otherwise, they would fight. On remote islands like Guam, Saipan, and the Philippines, small groups of Japanese troops hid in the jungles. They built shelters from palm leaves. They hunted wild pigs and gathered coconuts. They cleaned their rifles every morning, waiting for orders that would never come. To them, the distant rumble of American patrols was proof the war still raged. They saw leaflets dropped from planes claiming Japan had surrendered, but they thought it was enemy propaganda. The emperor could never yield. Among them were men like Hiroo Onoda, a young intelligence officer trained in guerrilla tactics. He was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines with orders to resist invasion and never surrender. When Japan lost the island, Onoda retreated into the mountains with 3 other soldiers. Their mission was clear. Stay hidden, gather information, wait for reinforcements. Years passed. No reinforcements came. Let us move across to Guam, where Shoichi Yokoi and his comrades survived by weaving cloth from tree bark. For months, they hid in caves fearing capture. When food ran out, they ate roots and frogs. When sickness came, they endured without complaint. Every sunrise was another chance to serve their emperor, even in exile. They believed Japan would one day return to claim them. In the late 1940s, villagers on these islands began to report strange sightings. Shadows in the forest, rice stolen at night, footprints near riverbanks. Some thought they were ghosts. Others knew they were soldiers still fighting a war long over. The local people left food hoping to bring them out, but most refused. They believed kindness from the enemy was a trick. Back in Japan, families of missing soldiers waited with faint hope. Every year, the government published lists of the dead and presumed dead. Some others refused to believe the news. They kept their sons' uniforms folded neatly in drawers. They prayed the emperor would one day announce their return. Let's float to 1950, 5 years after surrender. American soldiers stationed across the Pacific were still finding Japanese holdouts. Some surrendered willingly. Others resisted capture, believing they faced torture. In one case, a group in the Philippines attacked a local police station, thinking the war had reignited. When they learned the truth, they wept in silence. The emperor's voice had never reached them. Hiroo Onoda and his small group continued their mission. They read newspapers left by villagers but dismissed them as lies. They set traps in the jungle. They burned rice fields to disrupt what they thought were enemy supply lines. One by one, his companions were killed in skirmishes or surrendered. Still, Onoda refused to yield. He wrote in his diary that a Japanese soldier must never dishonor his country. Meanwhile, on Guam, Shoichi Yokoi spent 28 years hiding in a small cave. He crafted tools from bamboo. He kept his uniform carefully mended. Each night, he whispered prayers for Japan's victory. When he was finally discovered in 1972, he bowed to his rescuers and said, "Softly, it is with much embarrassment that I return." He had survived longer in hiding than many emperors had ruled. Let's drift to the dense forests of the Philippines once again. It was now 1974. Nearly 30 years had passed since the war ended. Onoda was still there. He lived off bananas and coconuts. He avoided villages but sometimes stole food from local farms. Several search teams tried to contact him, but he believed they were enemy spies. Japan even sent letters from his family, but he dismissed them as forgeries. The world moved into the jet age. Man landed on the moon. Yet for Onoda, time stood still. Finally, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki decided to find him. Suzuki had read about Onoda's story and believed he was still alive somewhere in the jungle. When he arrived on Lubang Island, he called out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and Japan are waiting for you." Against all odds, Onoda appeared from the forest, rifle in hand. The two men spoke under the trees. Onoda listened but refused to surrender without official orders. For him, a soldier's duty could end only with a command from his superior. Let's move to Japan, where the government searched for his former commander, Major Taniguchi. He was now an old man running a bookstore. When they told him Onoda was still fighting, he was stunned. He agreed to travel to Lubang Island. On March 9, 1974, he met Onoda deep in the jungle. Dressed in his tattered uniform, Onoda saluted as Taniguchi read the Emperor's final order. All combat activities are to cease. Onoda lowered his rifle and wept. After 29 years in the jungle, Onoda finally returned home. Tokyo welcomed him as both hero and relic of another age. Crowds gathered to see the man who had refused to surrender for nearly 3 decades. Yet behind his calm face was confusion. The Japan he returned to was not the empire he had left. Neon lights had replaced wartime banners. The young no longer bowed toward the palace. His world had vanished. Let's glide back now to those who never returned. Some soldiers died unknown in forgotten jungles. Others built quiet lives among island villagers. They married, raised children, and let their old names fade. For them, peace was not an event but a slow awakening from a dream that had lasted too long. By the 1980s, only a handful of holdouts remained. Each discovery made headlines. Each man became a symbol of devotion beyond reason. They were celebrated for loyalty, but also pitied for being trapped by it. In their minds, the emperor was still divine. In their hearts, Japan had never surrendered. The emperor's silence and the nation's memory. Let's drift now to the quiet streets of post-war Japan. The year is 1945. The fires of war have faded, but the ashes still glow in memory. Cities once proud now lie in ruins. The emperor's voice has been heard, yet its meaning still echoes through every household. The divine has become human. The sacred has fallen silent. The people must now rebuild not only their homes but their hearts. Japan's surrender did not simply end the war. It ended an idea. For generations, the nation had believed in divine destiny. The emperor was a living god. The soldiers were his chosen. When that belief shattered, millions faced a silence they could not explain. Men returned from the front, ashamed to have survived. Women stood in lines for rice, wondering if their sacrifices had been in vain. The rising sun flag was lowered. A new flag with the same red circle now stood for peace, not conquest. Let's move to the first years of occupation. American forces filled the streets. General Douglas MacArthur led the reconstruction. He met with Emperor Hirohito in a photograph that shocked the nation. The divine emperor stood beside the foreign general in plain clothes. For the first time, the myth of godhood was gone. The people saw their ruler as a man, quiet, polite, mortal. The new Japan rose from these ruins. Factories began to hum again. Schools rewrote their books. The code of the warrior was replaced with lessons of democracy and science. Yet under the surface, the old spirit lingered. Veterans avoided speaking of the war. Some carried guilt. Others carried pride. Few spoke of the jungles or the islands or the men who never returned. Let's float to the 1950s, when the country's focus shifted to progress. Bullet trains replaced troop trains. The Tokyo skyline reached higher each year. The world began to admire Japan not for its armies but for its technology. Radios, televisions, and cars carried its name across the globe. Yet the memory of war remained hidden like an old scar beneath polished skin. In villages across Japan, memorial stones stood quietly by the roads. Mothers visited shrines on the anniversary of surrender. They placed flowers and bowed their heads. Some still believed their sons were alive on distant islands. When news came of a soldier found decades later, they cried with both joy and sorrow. The nation had moved forward, but the past refused to let go. Let's move to 1974 again, the year Hiroo Onoda returned. Japan watched in awe as he stepped off the plane in full uniform, his sword shining in the sun. Reporters surrounded him asking if he regretted the years lost. He answered softly that a soldier does not question orders. His loyalty had not changed, but his country had. The emperor he had served now smiled from a television screen instead of a palace balcony. Onoda became a symbol of devotion, yet also a question. What is the value of loyalty when the cause is gone? Many Japanese people admired his endurance, but others felt uneasy. His long war reminded them of an era they wanted to forget. The generation born after 1945 could not understand a man who lived by the code of death before dishonor. They lived in a nation of peace shaped by the very defeat he had refused to accept. Onoda later left Japan to live quietly in Brazil. He said he found peace only in the silence of the forest. Let us drift toward the late 20th century when Japan began to reflect more openly on its wartime past. Museums opened. Textbooks debated what should be remembered and what should be forgiven. Survivors shared their memories of both suffering and guilt. The nation faced its own reflection and saw not heroes or villains but humans caught in the storm of history. For those soldiers who never returned, the jungles became their graves. Nature reclaimed the trenches. Trees grew over bunkers. The sound of war faded into the hum of insects. Yet their spirits lingered in stories told by villagers who once saw them moving through the night. These tales became part of Japan's quiet remembrance. Not of victory but of devotion carried too far. Let's move now to the emperor himself. After the war, Hirohito lived until 1989. He never spoke publicly of his decision to surrender in detail. Many wondered what he truly felt.
Some believed he bore deep regret.
Others thought he accepted his role as a symbol, not a ruler. When he died, millions lined the streets in silence. The nation bowed once again, but now to a man, not a god. His death closed the chapter that had begun with the empire's rise. Japan today stands as one of the most peaceful nations on earth. Its constitution renounces war. Its people value harmony above all. Yet the story of its soldiers remains both haunting and sacred. The world remembers the horrors of that war, but Japan remembers the quiet endurance of its people. The farmers who rebuilt, the mothers who waited, the soldiers who refused to let go of their duty, even when the world had changed. Let's float over to the islands once more, where the wind still whispers through palm trees. Beneath the soil lie the remnants of helmets and rifles now rusted and forgotten. Each piece tells a story of belief and confusion, of pride and sorrow. The Japanese soldiers of World War II were not demons or saints. They were men shaped by their time, driven by a code that outlived its purpose. Their story is not about victory or defeat. It is about the human heart when tested by faith beyond reason. It reminds us how loyalty can become both strength and burden, and how peace is sometimes the hardest order to obey. As the sun sets over the Pacific, the waves touch the shores where those men once stood. The empire they fought for is gone. The world they dreamed of has changed. Yet their memory drifts quietly through time, carried by the same wind that once filled the sails of a nation that rose and fell with the tide.